Hello everyone and welcome back to Panik Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. The desert nights were long, empty stretches of time, filled with nothing but the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional gust of wind rattling against the windows. The gas station stood alone, a small island of artificial light amidst an ocean of darkness. Most nights were the same, a few cars stopping by, weary travelers filling up their tanks, maybe a lost soul asking for directions. But tonight was different. Tonight, something felt wrong. I just didn't know why yet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their sickly white glow casting harsh shadows across the aisles of the gas station. I leaned on the counter, absent-mindedly flipping through an old magazine, my eyes flicking up every few minutes to the security monitors mounted on the wall. The desert stretched out beyond the station in every direction, an endless expanse of blackness, save for the dim glow of the neon sign outside. The graveyard shift was always lonely, but I had grown used to it. The occasional traveler stopping in for gas or a quick snack was usually the highlight of my night. But something felt different tonight, an unease settled in my gut like a heavy stone, though I couldn't place why. Then, the bell above the door jingled. I looked up to see an old man shuffle inside. His clothes were ragged, his eyes wild beneath the yellowed brim of his hat. He moved with a limp, his breathing heavy, as if he had been running. He took a step toward the counter, then hesitated. His gaze darted to the glass door, then back to me. I started to ask if he was okay, but before I could, he spoke in a hoarse whisper. He likes to play with his food. A chill ran down my spine. I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. What? But the man was already backing away. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the night, swallowed by the desert darkness. The automatic doors hissed shut behind him, and an eerie silence settled over the station. I let out a shaky breath, trying to shake the creeping dread curling around my ribs. Maybe he was just some crazy drifter. I told myself that, but my hands still felt clammy against the counter. Then, the security monitor flickered. I turned to the screens, my stomach twisting into knots. One of the cameras, the one overlooking the pumps, had gone static for a moment before clearing up. But now, something was there, something pacing just beyond the station's fluorescent halo. At first, I thought it was a man. But as the shape moved, I realized it was too tall, too thin. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its movements jerky, almost insect-like. My breath hitched as I watched it circle the station, keeping to the shadows just beyond the reach of the lights. A low hum filled the air, and then, suddenly, the pumps went dead. I whipped my head toward the register. The LED screen blinked once, then went black. The hum of the refrigerator units in the back cut out. The station was silent. The phone. I grabbed it off the wall, my heart hammering. No dial tone. Just dead air. A sharp knock echoed through the empty station. I froze. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. It wasn't at the front door. It was at the window by the snack aisle. I turned my head, my pulse thudding in my ears. The thing stood there, pressed against the glass. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was smooth, featureless, save for a gaping slit of a mouth. It didn't have eyes, yet I knew it was staring at me. The knocking continued, rhythmic and taunting. Knock. 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 I took a step back, my legs shaking. My mind screamed at me to run, but where? The desert stretched for miles, and the road was empty. I was alone. Then, the knocking stopped. The thing tilted its head, as if amused, and then it did something that turned my blood to ice. It lifted one impossibly long arm and pressed a single, bony finger against the glass. A slow, deliberate tap. Then, it raised the other hand. It had fingers. 10 of them. Then 15. Then 20. More and more sprouting, writhing like tendrils. It spread them against the glass, pushing, testing. A crack formed in the window. I bolted. I ran to the back, slamming the employee door behind me. My hands scrambled for my phone. Maybe if I got a signal. Maybe if I... Something scuttled against the roof. I stopped breathing. It was above me now. The panels in the ceiling creaked, dust drifting down in thin spirals. My fingers tightened around my phone, and I forced myself to move. There was a back door that led to the alley behind the station. If I could just make it outside, a voice rasped in the dark. He likes to play with his food. The old man's whisper, echoing from somewhere inside the station. Or maybe inside my head. The ceiling tiles bulged downward. Then, with a sickening crack, they split open. Something fell through. And then, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything, and for a moment, silence reigned. Then came the sound of something slithering, wet and deliberate, across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. I inched backward, feeling for the wall, for anything to ground myself. A raspy chuckle echoed through the room, the kind of laugh that sent icy fingers crawling up my spine. It was enjoying this. Playing with me. I had to move. Now. I groped for the doorknob, my sweaty fingers slipping. The sound of scraping nails, or claws, on the tile grew closer. My pulse pounded in my ears. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the alley, gasping for air. The cold night wrapped around me, but I had no time to savor it. I ran. My shoes pounded against the pavement, my lungs burned. Behind me, the gas station lights flickered back on, revealing something stretching out of the broken ceiling, its grotesque, elongated fingers reaching for me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The desert night swallowed me whole, and somewhere in the distance, I swore I heard that same, taunting knock. I don't know how long I ran. The desert stretched infinitely in all directions, but I didn't care, I just needed to get away. My legs screamed in protest, my breath came in ragged gasps, but still, I pushed forward. Then, headlights. A car on the horizon. I stumbled toward the road, waving frantically. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and a bewildered truck driver leaned out, asking if I was okay. I collapsed, gasping, barely able to choke out the words, "Gas station, don't go there." He helped me into the cab, and as we pulled away, I turned for one last look. In the distance, the gas station stood, its flickering neon sign humming against the darkness. And just beneath the glow, something tall and thin watched me leave. And then, it raised a hand. And knocked. There are places that never feel like home, even if they once were. My childhood house was one of them. It always held a strange, oppressive presence, a weight that settled in the bones. And when I moved back after my parents' passing, I felt it more than ever. Something had been waiting. The house was never quite right. Even as a child, I felt it, a lingering unease that clung to the air like cobwebs in the corners. But after my parents passed, I had no choice but to move back in. It was my home now, no matter how much the thought unsettled me. The first few nights were quiet, save for the usual creaks and groans of an aging house settling. I told myself it was just my imagination, just nostalgia tinged with grief. But on the fourth night, I heard it, a soft scuttling beneath the floorboards. Mice, I assumed. Or maybe rats. I made a mental note to call an exterminator. The next morning, I retrieved a flashlight and crouched by the entrance to the crawl space, a small wooden hatch in the hallway. The air that seeped out was damp and smelled of earth and mildew. I hesitated before prying the hatch open, revealing the darkness beyond. My beam of light swept across the narrow space, illuminating cobwebs and dust. Then I saw them, scratches in the dirt, trailing toward the opening. Not random scrapes, not the marks of tiny claws, but deep grooves carved by fingernails. I slammed the hatch shut and twisted the latch. I told myself it was old damage, nothing recent, just something left behind by some long-gone intruder. Still, a knot tightened in my stomach. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my pulse quicken, the wind against the windows, the tick of the pipes, the floor settling beneath old weight. When I finally drifted into a restless sleep, I awoke to something much worse. The latch. It had been locked. I was sure of it. And yet, in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, I saw the crawl space hatch was open. I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway stretched into darkness, the open hatch a gaping wound in the floor. And then my gaze shifted. My bedroom door was ajar. I knew I had closed it before going to bed. The air was thick with silence, an oppressive stillness that made my ears ring. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a brass lamp from my nightstand, and stepped toward the door. My own breath sounded deafening. A whisper of movement behind me. I spun, but there was nothing. Just the yawning dark of the hallway and the open hatch in the floor. Swallowing my fear, I reached for the door and pushed it fully open, scanning the hallway beyond. Empty. I walked to the crawl space, heart hammering. The air was frigid, thick with an earthy scent. I crouched and peered inside, my flashlight flickering as if protesting my intrusion. The scratches were deeper now. Fresh. Something had been here. And something had left. I locked the hatch again. This time, I pushed a heavy dresser over it. Whatever was down there wasn't getting out again. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. The scuttling wasn't beneath the floorboards anymore. It was inside my room. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved, slow and deliberate, a faint rasp against the wooden floor. My fingers tightened around the lamp, my only weapon. I turned my head, inch by inch, scanning the darkness. Then, the closet door creaked. A shadow shifted just beyond the edge of my vision. My pulse pounded in my ears as I forced myself to look. The door was slightly open, revealing only blackness within. My throat went dry. I wanted to run, to flee the house, but my legs felt like lead. I reached for my phone, but my fingers fumbled and sent it clattering to the floor. The noise was deafening in the silence. And then, from the darkness of the closet, something breathed. Shallow, raspy inhalations. Slow and measured, as though savoring the air. I scrambled back, my heart beat a drum against my ribs. I had to get out. Now. Summoning all my courage, I lunged for the bedroom door and yanked it open. The hallway loomed before me, dim and endless. But as I turned to flee, I saw it. A shape, just at the edge of the shadows, hunched and twisted, long fingers curling at its sides. It had been waiting. The dresser I had placed over the crawl space hatch was moved. Not thrown aside, not broken. Just moved, as if whatever was down there had simply lifted it with ease. I ran. Down the stairs, past the pictures of my parents on the walls, through the front door that groaned in protest as I yanked it open. I didn't stop running, not until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, shoving them into the ignition with shaking hands. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the house. My bedroom light flickered once. Then, the front door swung shut. Something was still inside. And it had let me go. For now. I didn't sleep that night. I drove aimlessly, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that exhaustion and grief had warped my mind. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I called a locksmith and a contractor. The crawl space was sealed permanently, reinforced with concrete. The locks on every door and window were replaced. I told myself it was enough. But at night, I still hear it. Scraping. Scratching. As if something is trying to find another way out. I don't sleep in the house anymore. I can't. I rented an apartment across town, convincing myself I'd return one day. But every now and then, I drive past. And every time, the lights in the house flicker. Sometimes, the front door is open, just a crack. As if waiting for me to come back. And I know that one day, I just might. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to fear my own home. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the chaos of the outside world. But something changed. It started with the smallest things, things I couldn't explain. And then, one night, it became impossible to ignore. It started so innocently. Little details that didn't make sense but didn't seem important at the time. Like the way my cat would act strangely at night, staring into the shadows in the corners of my room, her fur bristling and her tail twitching as if she could sense something I couldn't. And then, there were the sounds, small creaks in the house, whispers I couldn't identify, the faintest shuffle outside my window when there was no wind. I brushed it all off as my imagination. After all, nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Until the ordinary started becoming strange. It was the car that first made me uneasy. I had noticed it a few days earlier, a gray sedan, parked outside my house. I thought it was just another random car, someone visiting a neighbor. But when it stayed there the next day, and the day after that, I felt a prickle of discomfort. It wasn't parked in a normal spot either, it was always directly in front of my house, as if waiting for something. Or someone. It was never there for long, just parked and then gone again by the time I looked out the window. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The tension started to build. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just paranoid. After all, I lived in a quiet neighborhood. People parked on the street all the time. But then, one night, my phone buzzed as I was getting ready for bed. It was a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, you left your window open. Asterisk. I froze. My heart stopped, then began to hammer in my chest. My eyes darted to the window across the room. Sure enough, it was slightly ajar. But how could anyone have known that? I hadn't left it open that long, maybe a crack, a draft, but it didn't make sense. I rushed to the window and slammed it shut, the metal frame clanking as it clicked into place. My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't grip the latch. I stepped back, heart racing, trying to calm myself. It was just a coincidence. Someone had seen me through the window earlier in the day, maybe. Then, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message made my stomach turn. Asterisk, no. Not that one. Asterisk. I felt the blood drain from my face. My other window, the one beside my bed, it was open, too. Not fully, but enough. How did he know? Panic coursed through my veins. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the number. But it went straight to voicemail. I tried again, and again, my breath quickening with each attempt. No answer. My phone buzzed once more. Asterisk, I can see you. Asterisk. I stumbled back, the words searing into my mind. The room felt like it was closing in around me. I couldn't breathe. I was alone, asterisk a lone star. I glanced around, as though expecting someone to step out from the shadows. But the room was empty. Just the dim light from the hallway outside creeping through the cracks in the door. I put the phone down on my bed, trying to focus. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what was going on. This couldn't be real, could it? But the messages were real. The feeling of being watched was real. The car outside my house, real. Another buzz from my phone. Asterisk, the curtains are nice, but you should close them. I can see right through them. Asterisk. I froze. How could he know I hadn't closed them? I quickly stumbled over to the window, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and yanked the curtains shut. But even as I did, the feeling of being watched only intensified. The chill in the room was unbearable now, as if a cold presence was hovering just behind me. I stepped back, my eyes never leaving the window. Then came the next message. Asterisk, you shouldn't have done that. Asterisk. It wasn't just the words that terrified me, it was the voice. Low, distorted, like something twisted and wrong. I couldn't place it, but I knew it wasn't right. I knew it wasn't just some random person. It felt personal. As if this person had been watching me for so long, they could hear my every thought. I slammed my phone shut, but the buzzing didn't stop. It just kept coming, each message more chilling than the last. Asterisk, I'm still here. Asterisk. Asterisk, I can hear your breathing. Asterisk. Asterisk, you're not alone. Asterisk. I backed into the corner of the room, my mind spinning. What should I do? Should I call the police? But would they even believe me? How could I explain this? How could I explain that a stranger was watching me, sending me messages from an unknown number, taunting me with details no one else could know? Another tap at the window. I froze. It was soft, almost like a breeze brushing against the glass. But it wasn't the wind, it was a knock. A light, deliberate knock. My legs went weak, and I turned toward the sound. The window I had just closed. Someone was outside. The tap came again, a little louder this time. I crept toward the window, heart hammering in my chest, my mind screaming at me to run, to hide. But where could I go? The room felt small now, as though the walls were closing in on me. I could hear my breath echoing in my ears, too loud, too frantic. I glanced at my phone again. The screen lit up once more. The message appeared in bold, terrifying words. Asterisk, you really think I'm gone? I'm closer than you think. Look out the window. Asterisk. My entire body went cold. I couldn't stop myself. I turned toward the window, my body trembling. It felt like every part of me was screaming not to look. But my eyes were already fixed on the glass. There, illuminated by the flickering light of a street lamp, was a face. It was barely visible at first, just a silhouette, but then, as the light caught it, I saw his eyes. Hollow, wide, and empty, staring directly at me. His lips twisted into a grotesque smile, a smile that didn't belong to any human being I'd ever seen. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't breathe. The voice came through my phone again, faint and warped. Asterisk, I know where you live. Asterisk. The world spun around me, my knees buckling as I crumpled to the floor. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might tear out of my chest. He was still out there, watching. Waiting. And I knew, in that moment, there was no escaping him. No hiding. He wasn't going anywhere. He knew where I lived. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The police arrived a few hours later, after I'd made the call. I was a trembling wreck, barely able to explain what had happened. The car was gone by the time they arrived, and there was no trace of the man outside my window. They searched the perimeter of the house, checked every corner, but they found nothing. No footprints. No signs of forced entry. But when they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching. I moved out the next week. I couldn't stay in that house, couldn't live with the knowledge that someone had been lurking so close, knowing everything about me. Even now, I never stay in one place for long. Because he knows where I live. And that is the most dangerous thing of all. We thought we were ready. The long weekend was meant to be our escape. Just a group of friends, a few tents, and the quiet hum of the forest to clear our minds. We'd chosen the spot deep in the woods, far from civilization, thinking it would be the perfect place to disconnect. We laughed, set up camp, and made plans to hike the next morning. But none of us could have predicted what would find us. It started with the silence. At first, we thought it was normal, the deep stillness of nature, the kind you can only get when you're miles away from the nearest road or city. The kind of silence that settles on your shoulders, wrapping you in a false sense of peace. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, an unsettling quiet hung in the air. Even the usual sounds of animals seemed distant, muffled. Then came the scream. A long, drawn-out cry that pierced the air, echoing off the trees, and for a moment, I thought it was a trick of the wind. But it was real. It was urgent. And it was coming from deeper in the forest. We had no choice. We had to go. None of us knew how bad it would get. None of us knew that once we stepped into the woods that night, there would be no going back. The forest had always been thick, the trees towering above like silent sentinels. We'd hiked in the daytime before, but at night, everything seemed different. The shadows stretched long and unpredictable, and the air felt heavier, as though the night itself was trying to hold us in place. Do you think it's just an animal? Anna's voice broke the tension as we moved forward, our flashlights cutting weak beams through the darkness. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady, too steady. I don't know, I said, my throat tight with nerves. But that wasn't any animal I've ever heard. We kept moving, stepping over roots and fallen branches, the weight of the unknown pressing down on us with every step. The scream had cut through the stillness, so raw and full of terror. It had to be a person. But why would anyone be out here alone in the dead of night? We reached a clearing, our breath ragged in the thickening air. There was something wrong about the way the trees bent in this part of the forest, their limbs curling as though reaching for something. The quiet felt unnatural now, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then we saw her. A woman, standing alone in the trees. Her figure was a pale blur at first, but as we stepped closer, the details began to come into focus. Her clothes were torn, her skin slick with blood. But what struck me most was the look on her face, empty, distant, almost wrong. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crunch of our footsteps. It sounded like she was pleading, but there was something hollow in the way she spoke. I froze. "Are you okay?" Anna asked, her voice shaking, but not enough to hide the concern. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the woman, trying to understand what she was seeing. The woman's head turned sharply, a slow, deliberate movement, and her eyes locked onto Anna's. They were wide, too wide, strangely unblinking, like glass. My stomach churned. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Help me," the woman repeated, but this time, her voice changed. It was faint, but unmistakable. It was Anna's voice. I glanced at Anna beside me. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she took a cautious step back. "What the hell is happening?" she whispered, her voice a mix of disbelief and growing panic. I could hear the tremor in her words. The woman took a step toward us, the rustling of the forest floor beneath her feet unnervingly soft. As she moved closer, her features began to shift, as though her face was trying to adjust itself to something wrong. Her lips began to stretch into a smile, but it wasn't natural. The skin pulled too tightly, the corners of her mouth reaching far beyond what should have been possible. The smile, if you could even call it that, wasn't human. It was something else. "Please, help me," she said again, her lips stretching even further, impossibly far. Anna gasped and took another step back, her breath shallow, her body trembling. That's not me." I stepped closer, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what was happening. The woman's eyes flicked between each of us, but there was no recognition in them, just the empty stare of someone, or something, that shouldn't be there. "Please." Her voice rose in pitch, warping with each word. "Help me." Then I understood. It was Anna's voice. But it wasn't Anna. My legs refused to move, my body frozen in place. The world felt as though it was closing in around us. The woman's smile didn't fade. In fact, it only grew wider, stretching further, impossibly wide. The sound of the forest had gone completely still, like it was holding its breath, waiting. "Help me," she repeated again, and this time, it wasn't just Anna's voice. It was all of our voices. I turned to Anna, who was staring at me, wide-eyed and horrified. "Run!" I shouted, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was too late. The woman, the thing, was already moving again. Her body twisted unnaturally, a sickening snap of joints and bones as she lunged toward us. The smile never faded. The eyes, those glassy, empty eyes, were locked on me now. And in that moment, I realized this thing wasn't interested in Anna. It was interested in me. Without thinking, I turned and bolted. The others followed suit, scrambling through the thick brush, our hearts pounding in unison as the sounds of the forest came back, deafening, suffocating. We could hear it following us, the sound of twigs snapping and branches rustling, but we didn't dare look back. We ran. We didn't stop. But it was always there, just out of reach, lurking in the shadows, its voice echoing behind us. "Please, help me." We couldn't escape. We ran for what felt like hours, but the forest seemed endless. Every twist of the path, every turn, only led us deeper into its suffocating embrace. The night was oppressive, the shadows growing longer, stretching as if they were reaching for us. The wind howled through the trees, but I couldn't hear anything over the pounding of my own heart, the breathless gasps of my friends as we tore through the underbrush, desperate to get away. But it wasn't enough. The thing, the woman was still there, always just out of sight, its presence more felt than seen. The sound of its voice, now twisted and distorted, followed us relentlessly. It shifted, morphed, echoing with every one of our voices, mocking us. Please, help me. It wasn't Anna's voice anymore. It wasn't even mine. It was all of us, intertwined, impossible to tell apart. I glanced back, just once, heart hammering in my chest. I thought I saw something, just a flicker of movement behind the trees, the same hollow eyes staring through the darkness. A twisted smile stretched unnaturally wide, pulling the skin taut. I turned forward again, my legs aching, the fear gnawing at my insides. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing: it wasn't going to stop until it had us. We reached the edge of the forest. The trees thinned, and through the gap, I saw the faint glow of our campsite in the distance. But as we stumbled toward it, I felt the atmosphere shift. The oppressive feeling of the forest pressing against us was suddenly gone. The trees no longer whispered and creaked in the wind. It felt wrong. We burst into the clearing, but something was off. The campfire was still burning, but the light flickered unnaturally, casting odd, dancing shadows across the ground. My breath caught in my throat. Anna was already there. She was standing in front of the tent, her back to us, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her head was tilted at an odd angle, and as we moved closer, I saw the blood. It was streaked across her face, but this time, it wasn't fresh. It was dried, caked into her hair, her clothes. Anna. I called out, my voice shaking with uncertainty. She didn't turn. Anna, please. I said, taking a step toward her. And then, in a voice that was unmistakably hers, but hollow, empty, she spoke. Please, help me. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. I knew it wasn't her. I knew what had happened. But I couldn't stop myself from reaching out. I was drawn to her, unable to resist the pull of her voice, the desperation in it. I was a step too close. The smile came first. A slow, wide stretch across her face, too wide. The eyes, those black, empty sockets, turned toward me. And in the silence that followed, I understood. The thing wasn't Anna. It never had been. It had been waiting. Watching. And it wanted me. I turned to run, but the air was thick, suffocating. The trees seemed to close in, the ground shifting beneath my feet. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt heavy, my body weighed down by something I couldn't explain. The voice, all of our voices, filled the air around me. Help me. I screamed, but it was swallowed by the darkness. I don't know how much time passed. When I woke, I was back at the edge of the forest, sitting on the ground in front of the trees. The fire was out. The campsite was gone. My friends were nowhere to be seen. The forest was silent once again. The only sound was my own ragged breath. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it, watching me, waiting. It was in the trees, in the shadows, in every corner of my mind. It knew me. It knew all of us. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast, it would always be there. Always. Just out of sight. Just behind me. And it would never stop asking. Please, help me. It was a quiet night, too quiet, if I'm being honest. The kind of night that feels like the world is holding its breath, just waiting for something to happen. I was driving home, miles away from any town, with nothing but the road stretching out in front of me. The dashboard clock flickered 2 a.m., and I was starting to feel the weight of the hour, my eyes growing heavy as I fought the pull of sleep. The silence inside the car was only broken by the low hum of the engine and the occasional swoosh of tires skimming over the asphalt. I should have just kept my eyes on the road, kept driving through the empty highway like I had been doing for the past few hours. But when I saw him, standing there by the shoulder, thumb outstretched, looking so desperately in need of a ride, I couldn't bring myself to pass him by. He wasn't the type to be out there at this hour, his face shadowed by the dim glow of my headlights, his clothes ragged and worn, like someone who'd been walking for miles. He wasn't young, but there was something youthful about the way he stood, his posture a bit too stiff, his hands trembling slightly. His face was pale, like he'd been out in the sun too long, but something about it seemed wrong. His eyes glinted with something strange, something I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe it was the isolation, the eerie quiet of the night, or maybe it was just the part of me that still believed in helping others, no matter how dangerous it might seem. Either way, against my better judgment, I slowed the car and pulled over. The highway was empty, silent, and I convinced myself that it would be fine. What's the worst that could happen? He just needed a ride. I was wrong. The moment I stopped, I felt the temperature drop in the car. I rolled down the passenger window, and the man shuffled toward the door. He didn't say anything as he got in. There wasn't even a thank you or a nod of gratitude. Just a heavy, almost suffocating silence that filled the car when he settled into the seat. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, staring into the darkness. There was a strange intensity to the way he was sitting, like he was bracing himself for something. I tried to start a conversation, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "Where are you headed?" I asked, my voice tentative. He didn't answer. Just sat there, motionless, like he hadn't even heard me. I stole a quick glance at him. His clothes were a mismatched jumble, torn jeans, a jacket too thin for the cold air, his shoes worn down. His hair was dark, but messy, as if he hadn't bothered to comb it in days. Yet, his skin was unnaturally pale, the kind of pale that made you wonder if he had been sick or maybe dead. I shook the thought away. That wasn't possible. People don't just die on the side of the road and then get in cars. I tried again, a little more insistently. "Where are you from?" I asked. "What's your name?" He didn't respond immediately. Then, just as I thought I'd have to give up, he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Don't look at them." I frowned, unsure if I had heard him right. "Who?" I asked, my voice slipping into confusion. His eyes remained locked ahead, not shifting an inch, and I swear he hadn't even blinked. His voice came again, chilling in its flatness. "Don't look at them. No matter what, don't look." I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but the words died in my throat. My eyes flickered back to the road, instinctively following the beam of my headlights, and for the first time, I noticed something strange in the distance. There were figures standing along the shoulder of the road. Pale, motionless, unmoving. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, the kind of thing your mind plays on you when you're tired. But the figures, they were too still, too uniform. There were dozens of them, spaced out evenly, standing in silence. They weren't walking. They weren't even shifting their weight. They just stood there, like statues. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, my stomach turning into a heavy knot. I didn't dare take my eyes off the road, but every inch of my body screamed for me to look at them, to figure out what they were. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My fingers clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. I wasn't sure why I asked. I knew the answer wasn't going to make sense. The hitchhiker didn't respond. He just sat there, staring ahead, as if he hadn't even heard me. His presence felt colder, more distant, and the air in the car seemed to thicken, as though it was pressing in on me. I tried to shake the feeling off, focusing on the road again, but it was as if the more I looked ahead, the more I could feel them, the figures, closing in, growing nearer. Who are they? I asked, this time more urgently. What's happening? The man's voice cut through the silence, low and final. Asterisk, don't look at them, asterisk. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, as though the answer might be there. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or my mind playing tricks on me. But as I stared harder, the figures weren't just on the side of the road anymore. They were in the car. I didn't dare look back, but I could see them in the mirror, standing behind me, their featureless faces peering over the back of my seat, their limbs twisted in unnatural ways. There were 3 of them, no, 4. They stood perfectly still, unmoving. But I could feel their eyes on me, the pressure of their gaze pressing into my skin. My heart slammed against my chest as panic surged through me. I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal, my car lurching forward, the engine roaring in protest. But no matter how fast I drove, they were still there, their faces pressed against the back seat window, staring, waiting. I could hear my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. My mind was screaming, what do they want, but the question felt useless. I glanced at the hitchhiker, hoping for some kind of answer, but he was staring out the windshield now, unmoving, like he hadn't even noticed what was happening in the back seat. Who are they? I whispered again, more desperate this time, but the words caught in my throat. I glanced back at the mirror. They were closer now, those faceless, hollow figures. One of them reached forward, slowly, deliberately, its fingers just inches from my neck. Asterisk, don't look at them, asterisk, the man's voice came again, but this time it was barely audible, like a whisper carried by the wind. But it was too late. The figures were already closing in. Their cold, empty eyes never leaving mine. The air in the car thickened, pressing down on me, suffocating me, until I could barely breathe. The car swerved. I couldn't keep my focus anymore. My hands were slipping on the wheel. The road blurred around me as I slammed my foot on the brake, the tires screeching in protest. The car skidded to a halt, the world spinning around me. The figures were gone. The man was gone. And the back seat was empty. I sat there in silence, breathing heavily, the car still and motionless. I looked around, but there was nothing. No figures. No hitchhiker. The road was empty. But somehow, I knew. I knew they would always be there, asterisk watching star. Waiting. I had stopped. I had looked. And now, they were always with me. I sat there, my breath still shallow, trying to steady myself, my mind scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles ached. The world outside the car felt strangely distant, like a dream, a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The empty highway stretched out before me, silent as ever. But I knew something had changed. Something in me had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. The fear still clung to me, thick in the air, suffocating. The figures, asterisk them asterisk, they were out there, still waiting, watching. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that I would never be able to outrun them. I started the car again, my hands unsteady on the wheel. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just sit on the side of the road, lost in the dark. But as I pulled back onto the highway, the headlights flickered for a moment, casting strange shadows along the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing. No figures, no one there. But my reflection wasn't quite right. My eyes, they looked different. Darker, deeper, like something was missing. I turned my gaze forward, forcing myself to focus on the road. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow in the distance, just at the edge of the road. A figure. It was standing still, unmoving, watching. And then another one appeared. And another. I couldn't stop myself from looking. My eyes locked on them as my car sped past, my pulse racing. There they were, featureless and motionless, lined up like soldiers in the night. As I looked, I could feel the weight of their presence, their gaze following me. Don't look at them. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. Their faces, those empty, hollow faces, burned into my mind. They had always been there. Always watching. And as the road stretched out before me, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't driving home anymore. I had crossed into something else. Something from which there was no return. No matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I went, they would always be with me. Because I had stopped. Because I had looked. And now they were mine. Always. I never believed in ghosts or things that go bump in the night. I was always the skeptic, the one who would roll my eyes when people told their strange tales. I was rational, grounded in logic. But that all changed the night I moved into the house on Sycamore Lane. It was an old house, certainly, but it had a charm to it. The kind of place you could picture yourself growing old in. It wasn't perfect, but that's what I liked about it. The imperfections made it feel lived in, real. The moment I stepped inside, I felt something I hadn't in years, peace. It was everything I'd been looking for, a place to start fresh after the chaos of my life. Divorce had left me shattered, and I needed somewhere to heal. This house, nestled at the edge of town, promised just that. Quiet. Solitude. The first few days were blissfully uneventful. I unpacked boxes, rearranged furniture, and settled in like any new homeowner would. I spent time painting the walls, picking out curtains, even setting up the little garden in the back. Everything about the house seemed perfect. It was like it was meant for me, as if it had been waiting for me to discover it. But then, it started. At first, I thought it was the house settling. An old structure like this was bound to make some noises. The first sound came on the third night. A soft tapping. It wasn't loud at first, barely noticeable. I dismissed it as part of the house's natural rhythm. But by the end of the week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The tapping was slow, deliberate. Not the creaking of wood or the random groans of an aging building, but a rhythm. Something purposeful, like it was trying to get my attention. The sound would begin around 2 a.m. every single night, as though it had been programmed to do so. I tried to ignore it. It wasn't that big of a deal, right? Just the house, settling, maybe a pipe shifting. But as the days passed, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. And it always came when I was drifting into that heavy, vulnerable part of sleep, the moment when reality feels flimsy and everything around you seems just a little off. On the seventh night, the tapping escalated. It wasn't just a gentle knock anymore, it was sharper, faster, a thudding sound that made my skin prickle. I had enough. It couldn't just be a coincidence. There was something in the walls, and I was going to find out what it was. I called an exterminator, convinced I was dealing with rats or something equally mundane. The man arrived the next day, a gruff middle-aged guy who seemed like he'd seen it all. He wandered around the house, checking pipes, crevices, the attic. I stood nervously at the door, watching him with a mixture of hope and dread. Maybe he'd find something. Maybe I was just imagining things. After an hour of searching, he came down from the attic, wiping his brow with a grimace. "There's nothing up there," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "No rats, no pests, no nothing. I checked every room, every corner. This house is clean. You're probably just hearing the foundation settling." I wanted to believe him. God, how badly I wanted to. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. There was something in the walls. Something deliberate. It wasn't just the house settling. It was trying to tell me something. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping was louder, more persistent than ever before. It echoed through the house like a warning. As midnight crept closer, the noise began again. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the wall beside my bed. With shaking hands, I pressed my ear to the cold plaster. My heart hammered in my chest. The sound was so close, as though whatever was making it was right behind the wall. My breath came in short gasps as I strained to hear, my body rigid with fear. Tap, tap, tap. Then, suddenly, it stopped. For one fleeting moment, there was silence. A thick, suffocating silence that filled the room. I held my breath, waiting, praying it was over. But then, I heard something else. A whisper. It came from the wall itself, so close that it felt like the voice was right next to my ear. "I can hear you too." I froze. The words sent a chill down my spine. My stomach twisted with a terror I had never known. The voice was low, almost a rasp, but there was something about it that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a presence. A feeling that seeped into my very bones, as if the walls themselves were alive, aware of me, aware of everything. I pulled away from the wall, my hands trembling. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Was it just a dream? A hallucination? But no, the sound was real. I could still feel the weight of that whisper in the air, pressing down on me. I glanced around the room, hoping for some comfort, but it was as if the shadows had deepened, the corners of the room suddenly darker, more suffocating. I tried to push it all aside, to convince myself I was just tired, that it was all in my head. But the tapping started again, this time louder, faster. A frantic, desperate sound, like something, or someone, was trying to break free. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even think. My eyes darted from the walls to the door, the ceiling to the floor, but nothing felt right. The house had changed somehow. It felt alive, as if it were breathing along with me, aware of every move I made. The next few nights were the worst. The tapping came with such intensity that I could feel the vibrations under my skin. I tried everything, sleeping with the lights on, moving to the guest room, even leaving the house for hours at a time, but it didn't matter. The tapping always returned. I began to lose track of time. The days bled together, and I could feel myself unraveling. The voice never spoke again, but I heard it in my mind now, every waking moment. "I can hear you too." I couldn't escape it. The walls seemed to close in, the house seeming smaller, more oppressive with each passing hour. It was as if whatever was inside those walls was growing, evolving, becoming more powerful. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. It was clear now that whatever had made its home within those walls wasn't just a pest or a rat, it was something far worse. But when I tried to leave, the door wouldn't open. The handle twisted, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, once easy to open, now refused to give. It was like the house was trapping me. And all the while, the tapping, the rhythmic, relentless tapping, echoed around me. Closer now. I pressed my ear to the wall again, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a new sound now, a faint scratching, like nails on stone. But then, through the steady tapping, I heard something else. "You're not leaving." And that's when I understood. The house wasn't just haunted. It wanted me. The days stretched on, though I couldn't say how long I'd been trapped. The walls became more suffocating with every moment, as though the house were closing in on me, pushing me deeper into its grip. I no longer felt like I was the one in control. The house was. It could hear my every breath, every heartbeat. I was nothing but a visitor in its domain. And then, one night, the tapping stopped. It wasn't gradual. There was no warning. One moment, it was there, louder than ever, and the next, it was gone. I waited, breathless, my ear pressed to the wall once again. But all I heard was silence. The silence was worse than the tapping. It felt heavy, as though the house were waiting for me to make the next move. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't leave. Not anymore. I had become part of the house now. Just another whisper behind the walls. The tapping would never stop. And neither would I. We thought it would be just another weekend of camping. A break from our busy lives, a chance to reconnect with nature and with each other. We were a group of friends, close since high school, who had spent countless weekends in the woods. But this time, something felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows longer, as though the forest itself was watching us. We had ventured farther into the woods than usual, taking a path less traveled, hoping to escape the noise and distractions of everyday life. The forest was thick with trees, their trunks twisting upward like skeletal arms reaching for the sky. The deeper we went, the more isolated we became. It felt like the kind of place where things that shouldn't be real might just come to life. We set up camp in a small clearing, nestled between towering pines. The evening air was crisp, and the fading sunlight filtered through the branches, casting a golden glow over the forest floor. As the night crept in, we built a fire and gathered around it, telling ghost stories, silly tales that always seemed to lose their bite when we were surrounded by friends. But that night, the atmosphere felt different, as if the stories we told weren't just stories anymore. The night felt alive. And whatever we had disturbed in the woods was now waiting for us. The fire crackled and popped, the sound of logs shifting in the flames filling the space between our words. Everyone was laughing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest was too quiet, the wind barely stirring the leaves. I kept glancing into the shadows, expecting to see movement, but nothing ever came. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine, but it gnawed at me all the same. By midnight, I could barely keep my eyes open. The fire was dying down, the orange glow casting long, dancing shadows on the trees. My friends were still talking, but my eyelids felt heavy, the warmth of the fire lulling me into a half-daze. I decided to crawl into my tent and try to get some sleep. As I zipped up the door and settled into my sleeping bag, I told myself it was nothing, just the effects of too many ghost stories and too little sleep. I closed my eyes, listening to the sounds of my friends in the distance, their voices muffled by the thick forest air. But as I lay there, the soft rustling of dry leaves reached my ears. I thought it was just a breeze at first, the wind pushing through the underbrush. But no, this was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Slowly, my heart began to thud in my chest. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps were soft, but unmistakable. Bare feet, shuffling slowly, circling my tent. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling. Slowly, I unzipped the door of my tent and poked my head out into the darkness. The campfire had almost burned out, leaving only a faint orange glow in the distance. I could see the trees swaying gently in the breeze, but there was no one around. No figure standing in the shadows. I breathed a shaky sigh of relief, cursing myself for getting paranoid. It was probably just an animal. I climbed back into my sleeping bag, trying to force myself to relax. But then, the footsteps started again. Closer this time, right up against the fabric of my tent. They weren't just circling anymore. They were stopping and starting, pacing in front of me. I could hear the soft scrape of toes dragging against the ground. I froze, too terrified to move, too terrified to call out to my friends. What if they didn't hear it? What if it was something else? The footsteps seemed to pause, as though whatever was out there was waiting, listening. The silence was thick, suffocating. I was holding my breath, my heart thundering in my chest. What if it was something in the woods? A person? A wild animal? Or something worse? Then, just as quickly as they had started, the steps stopped. A long, unsettling silence followed, and I waited for what felt like hours before I dared to close my eyes again. I barely slept that night. When dawn finally broke, I rushed out of the tent, desperate to leave the oppressive weight of the woods behind. The others were already up, talking and laughing, acting like nothing had happened. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We packed up camp and headed back to the car, the familiar trail feeling like a lifeline. As the sun climbed higher, I could finally breathe a little easier. The woods were behind us, the road ahead leading to safety, to the comfort of home. Or so I thought. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. The unsettling feeling of the night still lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but I brushed it off. I was home now, away from the woods, and that should have been enough to shake the dread from my bones. I unpacked my gear, taking my time, hoping that would help me unwind. The evening passed uneventfully. I ate dinner, watched some TV, and eventually decided to go to bed. The soft hum of the city outside my apartment was a stark contrast to the silence of the woods, and I felt myself relaxing, the tension of the trip finally starting to leave my body. But then, hours later, I heard it again. The soft shuffle of bare feet on pavement. I froze mid-bite, my dinner forgotten. My heart pounded as I looked out the window, but the street below was empty. No one was walking. No one was near my building. I sat there, frozen in place, straining to listen. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, as if they were right outside my window. Soft, shuffling steps, dragging against the ground in that same, rhythmic pattern. I stood up, heart racing, and cautiously made my way to the window. The streetlights cast a dim glow over the pavement, but there was no one in sight. No shadow moving, no figure lurking in the dark. But I heard it again. The shuffling steps, so close now that I could almost feel the weight of them pressing against the glass. I backed away from the window, my legs weak, my breath shallow. It was then that I realized it wasn't just in my head. It had followed me. The thing that had been circling my tent in the woods was now outside my home. I ran to the door, locking it with trembling hands, but the steps didn't stop. They continued, slow and deliberate, outside my apartment. It was pacing back and forth, as if it knew I was inside. Waiting for me to come out. waiting for something. I grabbed my phone and texted my friends. I asked if they'd heard anything strange last night, but the messages went unanswered. The phone buzzed with one reply: "Everything's fine. You're just imagining things. We're all home now. It's over." I wanted to believe that. But I couldn't. The footsteps didn't stop. For the first time, I understood, the forest had never let us go. The thing that followed us, that haunted our camp, wasn't a mere figment of our imagination. It was real. And it wasn't finished with us. I stayed awake the entire night, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to face the thing that stalked just beyond the door. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there, but the sound, those slow, shuffling steps, never left. They were always just out of sight, just out of reach, and I knew, deep down, it wasn't leaving. And neither was I.